Good evening. Right now, Metro Police are desperately searching for the person or people responsible for killing a man and a woman.
And I got a male down in the middle of the street.
Breaking news now, a triple shooting leaves 2 dead.
Never expect for somebody to tell you your loved one was murdered.
This Labor Day will mark 42 years that have haunted the St. Cloud family.
30 years. 30 years this family has waited for answers.
A couple months go by, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you really start to struggle with the idea that the case might not get solved and that somebody might get away with murder.
It's very unfortunate that we have any cold cases at all, and certainly unfortunate that we have as many as we do. And that's why Ryan's work and the work of Project Cold Case is so important.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Yeah, it's noon now, but thanks for joining us today. We were scheduled to have our elected state attorney, Melissa Nelson, join us today, who has been a huge supporter of Project Cold Case and has a passion for helping solve the unsolved cases that we deal with on a daily basis. But she had an emergency come up, and she had to unfortunately go to a funeral today. So, she's going to reschedule and join us at another time. And we had another guest on our list that we wanted to have in. This is my good friend and colleague, Tim Quick. Thanks for coming, Tim.
Pleasure to be here, Ryan.
Yeah, Tim is the chief investigator for the state attorney's office. So you work daily with Melissa Nelson and with the investigators in that building. We're in the 4th Judicial Circuit here, so that's Duval, Clay, and Nassau counties, Northeast Florida area. And Tim, our viewers will probably love this. You've spent 28 years with NCIS, the real NCIS.
Yeah.
But you're being with them for 28 years. You actually have some connection to the TV show as well.
A little bit. I made a few visits out to the TV show, and it was actually a pretty cool visit. And there were good people out there.
Yeah.
It did wonders for the agency. It put us on the map.
And tell us, they're coming to you guys to get real
ideas.
Ideas, real stories, how things actually work in a naval criminal investigation.
Absolutely. And the technical advisor for the original TV show was a former NCIS agent. So he kind of keeps it real. They send their scripts to NCIS headquarters to review and make some tweaks on to make it realistic. It's still Hollywood, so
sure.
Some things have to be a little more glamorous than in the real world. But they've done a good job portraying the day-to-day life of NCIS, and it really did put NCIS on the map. When I started, people didn't know who NCIS was.
Right.
Now it's known around the world.
Yeah. So you aren't the character. Mark Harmon is not based off of you, though. Is that?
I like to tell people it is, but I can't take credit for that.
No, it really is interesting. We were talking about it earlier. That's one of the shows my wife and I we try to watch and DVR and make sure that we see. And it does give you a little glimpse, and I always liked it because right out of the gate with Jacksonville having such a Navy presence,
right.
It was not uncommon for Mayport or NAS Jax or Jacksonville to be mentioned,
right.
in an episode, which is always kind of neat to have your hometown.
And I've pitched the idea NCIS Jacksonville. They haven't picked that up yet.
No, well, keep trying because
right.
I'm telling you, we would be fully on board with that. It's great to hear too that there's a good working relationship between the show and the real life thing, because that's something that we are always trying to make sure that it's an accurate portrayal if we're dealing with the media. There is kind of sometimes a desire to make it even more sensational.
Right.
And in our world, a murder should be sensational enough. You don't have to do anything special with
right.
it to make it important. But sometimes TV, it's always trying to capture those viewers and be a little bit different. But so tell me a little bit. We've had lots of conversations over the last when did you start?
January of 17.
17. So we're at 2 years
In the
now.
third year, correct.
Yeah, and we met pretty early on once you got over there.
I think month 3 when I got here, that you, Dan Jansen introduced us.
Yeah, so I've heard a little bit of that, but tell us about your experience with NCIS and your background a little bit.
Before NCIS, I was a street cop in Illinois, worked for a sheriff's department in Mount Vernon, then went from the sheriff's department to the police department. And it's kind of a blessing looking back on it, but they had layoffs at the police department, and I was third from the bottom. They laid off 3 officers, and I was laid off for a short period of time. But when I got laid off, I applied to a few agencies. One of those was NCIS. So I eventually got called back to work with the police department, and then about a year later, NCIS offers me a job. So I took it, ran, and first office was Great Lakes, Illinois, which is the Chicago area, which is very, very, very cold.
And that's where the where Navy boot camp is.
Yeah, boot camp and training command. Spent 4 years there, and then transferred overseas to Guam, a small island in the Pacific, 8 miles wide, 30 miles long. Did a wonderful 2.5 years out there. My son was born out there, and then we transferred from there to Jacksonville.
Okay.
We stayed for a long time. I got 2 kids all the way through from kindergarten through high school, and then my third child, Janice, she was a sophomore in high school, and they called my number and I got transferred. So I did the next 2.5, almost 3 years. Living in Georgia and then D.C.
Yeah.
While she finished high school.
And when you were here, were you at NAS Jax?
I did split time between Jax and Mayport. I did
Okay.
a year on an aircraft carrier, the Kennedy.
Yeah.
And then worked cold case homicide. That's how I met Melissa. Worked some narcotic stuff, a little bit of everything while I was here.
When being in Jacksonville, having such a military presence and a couple of Navy bases, and there was a third one,
Cecil Field.
Cecil Field,
Right.
years ago, and so it was not uncommon for there to be some overlap between local police and NCIS.
Absolutely. They didn't stop at the fence line.
Yeah.
The sailors would go out in town. The bad guys would find out where the sailors are. Bad guys would come on the base. So we had a good relationship with all the state, local agencies. Worked some good cases with them.
Yeah, and there still are a number of good NCIS agents here that have that connection.
Correct.
That have access to you guys at the state attorney's office.
Yep.
Bill Elfline, I know, is.
Yep, we gave him an office, the state attorney's office.
Yeah,
as I got here and set up.
That's right. He was neighbors with me in my office over there, and I when I went to the Southeastern Homicide Investigators Association annual conference in Baton Rouge this year, Bill was there and a number of other NCIS agents from around here, and so I got to talk to them a little more and get to know them a little bit, and then of course the guy I call the godfather of cold cases is Lou Eliopoulos, who you worked very closely with, and he's still up in the DC area.
Yeah. If you ever watch the TV show, the original NCIS show, in Ducky's lab, in the medical lab there, Lou's books are on the shelf.
Yeah, yeah,
cool.
That is cool. Yeah, he always says that, and I should have brought in. I have Lou's book on my shelf, and see, I keep telling Lou I got to get him over here to the office so he can actually sign that book. Though
right.
I need the autograph copy. So, give us. You said the last few years you were in Georgia and then D.C. area.
Yeah,
or
I
Virginia?
spent. It was a very short tour at our at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Brunswick. We have a contingency response field office. And that's all the deployers going to and from the war zone. So I did 8 months there, and 4 of that was in Afghanistan. So a very short tour. Came back. I transferred to headquarters. I was the executive assistant to the deputy director for a year. And then for the next 2 years, I was the assistant to the director. Did that for 2 years, and then transferred to Norfolk as special agent in charge.
Special agent in charge.
And
Yeah.
my plans were to stay there and retire probably in 2018, and then Melissa gets elected state attorney, and I end up back in Florida.
And so you guys met while you were down here with NCIS, and she was a prosecutor.
Correct. In 2003, I was assigned to a cold case homicide unit NCIS had at the state attorney's office. I did that for 3 years. Melissa was a young prosecutor.
Yeah.
I got to know her professionally, and then also on the side, my wife was a dental hygienist. And I got to know Melissa.
That's great.
So-
It's funny, and one of the reasons I'm excited to get Melissa in here is you keep hearing these stories about her that start professional, but she really does care about people personally.
Yeah.
And it's multiple people that you meet. Oh, we met like this, but we have this this friendship or this bond
Right.
or this relationship. And I think that just speaks volumes about her, how much she really does care about people and about these victims. I mean, she's so quick to meet with families. She's so quick to have a conversation with families. And as one of those families, that's just, it really is powerful and meaningful when somebody in her position takes notice.
Right.
A lot of times you just feel like nobody's out there really paying attention or caring, and you guys, since she's been elected and brought on you and created her team, there's been a lot more focus on cold cases and revisiting some of that. I know she has a couple of cases from her old days prosecuting that still stick with her that she would like to see some resolution to. So she's fighting for us and with us, and she's, between you and her, you've given me access to come in there and meet with you all, to meet with your investigators, stuff that certainly doesn't happen on the regular basis around, and so we appreciate that. And that's one of the things when we're talking with families, it gives us a unique opportunity to not just say, yeah, we'll take a look. It gives us an opportunity to say, yeah, we'll talk to somebody that really can take a look. So we really appreciate that.
Well, it's a good relationship, and you having access to our office,
Yeah.
uninhibited access. You can come and go as you want.
I got my little badge
That's
that
right.
I can come
And,
in and out the employee door.
We had an office for it. We had to move you to a different office, but wherever you want to sit, and you're always welcome there. You know that. But that voice that you have for the victims is important to us, and
Well, it
Melissa
shows.
recognizes that, and I do as well.
Yeah, well, it shows, and we appreciate that. Yeah, I wasn't utilizing that office as much as I thought I would, but mostly because now our office is only a few blocks away from you. So,
And you got a good setup here, so
we do.
I'm glad for staying here.
We're happy to be here. We were involved in a couple of different things together, including the Police Council, and that's a group that meets monthly and supports law enforcement.
The 200 Club.
The 200 Club now officially, and so it supports families of law enforcement, and so, I forget sometimes that I'm in a unique position to see presentations that not everybody gets to see, and hear stories that not everybody gets to see, and I sit at tables with you, with Tom Brady, who is a colleague of yours at NCIS and now is a professor at Kaiser University. That's forensics genius, and so sometimes just Chip Matherson that is in our club, and you guys have stories and have been places and have seen, you've seen the worst of the worst, you've seen the best of the best, you've seen it all. You've actually have experience, at ground zero, so to speak, and you did a presentation a couple of weeks ago at Police Council about an ambush down in Puerto Rico, in 1979.
Correct.
And December 3rd, 1979. We're going to show some of the newspaper clippings and take us through a little bit, just a brief synopsis of what happened, and then what you and Lou and a small team of people, dedicated people, were able to accomplish years later.
December 3rd, 1979, it was a bus, 17 sailors being transported from a base in Sabana Seca to a remote listening facility. And a domestic terrorist group there was looking for retaliation against the federal government, and they selected this bus. And their intent was to try to kill as many people as possible on that bus.
It was a school bus.
It was a school bus, yellow school bus containing Navy personnel.
Right.
And
Yeah.
It wasn't marked USN or Navy, but didn't take long to figure out because it left the base and the regular intervals who was on the bus. So, a clear ambush. The path of the bus was blocked by a pickup truck. A van sitting on the side of the road opened fire, ambushed, fired multiple rounds into the bus, killed the driver, John Ball, killed another pastor, Emil White, injured 9 others, very serious injuries.
Yeah.
And then the ambush van with the occupants leaves the area. The Macheteros, Los Macheteros, the domestic terrorist group, took responsibility for the ambush, but for years it went unsolved. And FBI looked at it, Police of Puerto Rico worked it, NCIS was involved early on, best we could. And then really following the terrorist attacks on 9/11, NCIS as a whole said, we need to go back and look at this case. It's a terrorism case. Let's put this case together. So Lou, myself, Dave Early, Thomas Simos, Louis Vargas, a whole bunch of people came together, worked with the FBI in Puerto Rico, worked with the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York, to bring finally this case to resolution. It was prosecuted under a RICO case, a murder predicate, but it was tough bringing it together. We would try to get it prosecuted in Puerto Rico. We were not successful, but eventually, May 8th, 2014, someone was sentenced for that case in New York.
And you guys, I mean, you were told you'd never see the inside of a courtroom.
We were told we'd never see the inside of the courtroom, and then Lou Eliopoulos and I were sitting at the prosecutor's table in May 2014, and Lou leans over to me and says, I don't know about you, but this is like the inside of a courtroom to me. So we still laugh about that.
And yeah, I mean, that was 30 years later, or almost
35
years later.
And really the big thing that stood out to me, and that I think I told you at the police council, was the victim's widow was there, and his daughter was there. And then other people who were on the bus were there in the courtroom that day. And we never told the victims or the families that we were working this case. We didn't want to get their hopes up.
Right.
And we didn't tell them until about a month out that the case was going to be sentenced. And we invited them to the hearing that day.
You bring up a really important point that sometimes families, and I can speak from experience, don't understand initially that sometimes these cases are being worked. Sometimes they're being worked peripherally, sometimes they're being worked in depth, but almost never does the family receive a phone call for that very reason, that
we'll get their hopes up.
It may go nowhere.
Yeah, and sometimes it's important. You have to reach out because you have to get some information or some leads, but we just felt the timing wasn't right, and we waited, and they were very, very thankful. And every year, Patty Ball, the victim's widow, sends an email to the group thanking us for not forgetting. And that date of the anniversary of her husband's death always was a bad day for her. She dreaded days and weeks leading up to it. She dreaded that day, but now it's a day of celebration for her. Yeah, and so we're grateful for that.
Yeah, you guys did an amazing job, and I like to point out that it's not out any malicious reason that you don't let the family know. You don't want to jeopardize the prosecution. You want to see if you have anything. For 35 years, I'm sure there were multiple times where people were taking a look at that case. Right. And that would have gotten old really quick if every year or two somebody called the family and said, hey, we've opened it back up.
What can you tell us?
And then there's nothing. And then there's nothing. And then there's, you know what I mean? Right. And then 35 years later, they finally...
I didn't realize until I was talking to the police council a couple weeks ago that 28 years with NCIS, I worked on that case about 14 years out of my 28 years. Yeah. So
I mean, the dedication and commitment out there, you know, to a lot of these cases where people have a personal connection even without being personally, you know, affected by it. It's important. And you had some help in another local case that had an NCIS connection. It was Tammy Welch, was a 10-year-old girl, and Patty and I talked about that case a few weeks ago on our Facebook Live because we sat through the trial just last year, late last year, November and December. And that was another one where I've grown pretty close to Mr. Welch now. We bonded during that time of the trial, and he's watching, I think, today. So you know, he's such a good man, and what he had to go through for all those years. But it was similar. He told the story about how he didn't want to reach out to law enforcement because he didn't want to bother them, and he didn't want to harass them or feel like he was harassing them. And his wife didn't tell him that every year on the anniversary she was reaching out to law enforcement, you know, just to kind of remind them. They were in the Navy, so they were moving, and she'd update the contact information. And they had no idea that NCIS and the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office was looking back at that case. And Lou Eliopoulos, you know, basically when he finds out that there's going to affect an arrest in that case, he drives to the family's house to meet with them, but sits in the driveway, like calls the family and says, I need to meet with you. And they're like, okay, when? He's like, today. Okay, where are you? I'm in your driveway, but I'll be in there in a little while. I got to make a few calls and I'll come in when I. And Lou was basically waiting for the official word that the arrest had happened. And then, went in there to tell the family that, again, Tammy was never forgotten, that case was never, put on a shelf to never be looked at again, that there were people, actively trying to resolve that case. And that ended in a conviction. And that defendant will spend the rest of his life in prison.
And that's a case we lived for years. Tom and Seamus, Dave Early worked it early on with Lou and never gave up. And then I had it for a little while after Tom transferred, and Tom came back to Jacksonville and saw it through to the end. But the compassion and the diligence that all those people put in that case was just amazing. Gary Stuckey, JSO, good people. But again, that's like with the Macheteros case, being with the victims' families in the courtroom, being with the Welch family for the trial and for the sentencing. That's important to all of us.
It was. I mean, that was a very upsetting time. I mean, it was a sexual assault and murder on a 10-year-old girl. It was extremely graphic during testimony, during closing arguments, things that you don't ever want to hear, much less hear spoken about your child. No,
I can imagine how tough that was for Mr. Welch.
And Mr. Welch and Jennifer, Tammy's sister, they endured and they believed in the system, and they got a conviction. I think, Mr. Welch would have liked to have seen the death penalty. I know he would have liked to have seen the death penalty. I will never know how that jury reached the vote that it did.
Yeah.
But that's, the system.
We have no control over that.
We have no control over that. We do have, I think most people would say, the best system in the world. It's not always perfect, and it doesn't always get us everything that we want. But that's the system, and fortunately, that defendant, I don't even like saying his name because I don't think he deserves it.
Conviction, and he will spend the rest of his life in prison.
The rest of his life in prison. So, well, tell us some of what you guys have going on at the state attorney's office now. I mean, you've created, Melissa's created a cold case initiative. She has kind of committed to the families of unsolved cases in this community that her and your investigators are available to work with law enforcement and your judicial circuit to help out, to review cases. You have prosecutors that are now willing to voluntarily look through cases to see what is needed. Cold cases, nothing's ever black and white, and a case isn't always cold because there's no idea who did it. Sometimes the case is cold because you know exactly who did it, but you don't have enough evidence to prove it. So technology is constantly moving forward and getting better, and sometimes there is the opportunity to retest evidence or look at it in a different way, or call in one of our buddies, Lou or Tom Brady or somebody to take a look at it. And that's, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of what you guys have done here, is create another avenue for people to look at and for prosecutors to say, okay, this is what I need to be able to move forward on this case.
Correct. Getting started, one thing we did was we reached out, tried nationwide to see who had a similar program that was working and successful, and it appeared to be Brooklyn, New York had the best system going, where the Brooklyn DA's office is working with the NYPD on cold case homicide. And I can't remember the number they had, but it was somewhere around 8,000 unsolved homicides. And part of the difficulty was identifying which cases were workable. And so the DA's office with NYPD kind of goes through the cases and starts picking out the cases which seem to be the most practical for working. And that's one of the things we want to look at here, the best approach. We met with them, met with NYPD. We've had Lou down here on a couple of occasions to give training to local law enforcement and to the prosecutors. And we're ready to move forward.
Yeah. And I think, this is a good thing. Anytime you have that much experience that you have in your office, looking at cases, you really hit the nail on the head with, in Jacksonville, we have about 1,400 to 1,500, give or take, unsolved murders. And it's impossible to know which of those, only need to be retested, only need to have evidence retested, or which ones, the evidence is gone, missing maybe, or lost in the roof collapse. And so that's part of the problem is just getting them to that point where
Prioritizing. One thing too we like to look at is bringing a case. It's cold. Doesn't mean we may not be able to solve it now, but bringing it up to 2019 standards, which could be through testing or updating the witness file, family members. Because one thing is very important we look at is a change in relationships.
Right.
So to go out and identify ex-spouses that may be helpful to us. As you know, Lou's mentioned this before in some training, about 15,000 homicides a year, and about 60% of those are solved. So the number's growing every year on unsolved homicides. The number's not going down.
No.
So it's something we got to look at, got to stay on top of.
And it's weird when you start crunching those numbers. And I know Lou does this. You'd think with technology being so good and cameras being everywhere that more cases would be solved than not. That number would be going up in clearance rates, but murders are so random now sometimes that there's no connection with people, or they're gang related or drug related, or there's people are scared to get involved, and so it's the clearance rates are struggling, because of factors like that. And so we need, if people out there believe that they don't need to get involved because there's a camera on every corner and and DNA technology is what it is, they're wrong. Like law enforcement very much needs the public's support and help in clearing these cases. Lou, he says it in all of his trainings, that investigating cold case is not a luxury, it's a responsibility, and these are bad guys that are still out on the street, still able to do something. And so, when he talks about his training techniques and bringing it up to investigative standards, as a family, you want a resolution, you want an arrest, you want justice, but at the very least, give me that. You get it up to current investigative standards, and I think that's very doable, even with a city as large as Jacksonville, and they did it in New York. They were able to prioritize, which is, I understand, is a tough thing to say, prioritizing murders, but I feel like I can say that because my dad's murder would be on the low end of that prioritization scale. Everything that could be done has been done, at least as it stands today.
As you know, some cases can't be solved, unfortunately.
Right.
But again, doesn't mean you can forget about them. Bring them up to standards. Hope for that phone call to come in, somebody to give you a tip that we didn't have before, an admission or a confession that wasn't out there.
I think Lou says that somewhere north of 60% of cold cases are solved because of that change in relationship. And I think, we might start to see that number come down a little bit with technology with the DNA, genetic genealogy and DNA. That might balance it out a little bit, but that's very telling. And that, to me, is why, what Project Cold Case does by just raising awareness for cases really could be the difference in solving one or not. Because if somebody was in an abusive relationship, or they had a dependency issue, a substance issue at a certain time in their life, and they have cleaned up or found religion or grown up and matured, whatever that case is, separated themselves from that lifestyle, they could hold the key to solving cases that DNA isn't going to solve.
That's why you never give up.
That is. I mean, that's, we always tell people, like, if there's no DNA, that's not the end of the game.
No.
You know what I mean? If there's no witnesses, that have come forward, that's not the end of the game. Like their technology, the way it's improving, and the things that labs are able to do now, there will always be hope. There should always be hope. All it takes is one person calling in. And I've spoken at a number of conferences now, and it's always interesting to me when somebody will come up to me afterwards and say, you keep telling those families don't give up hope. They say, we had a guy homeless guy walked into a church in our jurisdiction a couple weeks ago and asked the preacher if he could talk, and said, I've got a confession. I killed somebody when I was 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and it's just eating at me. and I don't know what to do. And the preacher said, well, let's go down to the police station and let's tell them what happened, and ask for forgiveness, whatever. You got to face the consequences now. But they always come up with some random story of somebody just calling in, walking in. We hear about them. Sometimes they walk into the
So
the
usually when you
station.
least suspect it too, it'll happen. So that's why the avenues are always open. Always able to answer the phone, talk to somebody, receive an email, talk about a case.
Yeah, it's been great. Clint, what other picture we have? Do we have that annual report? Yeah. So this was last year's State Attorney's Office 4th Judicial Circuit annual report, and it was a briefing of everything that you guys had done throughout the year, and then kind of some goals and what you were looking for moving forward. And this was really cool to me because when Melissa took office, I didn't know her. I had never met her, but I had sent her a letter just letting her know who I was and what my organization was. And the next thing I knew, we were meeting. The next thing I knew,
You had an office.
I had an office, and she was ready to launch an initiative, and so she cared, and it was interesting. And I'll never forget, you were in that meeting with me, and she held up a spreadsheet, and she said, this is my bucket list for my first year in office. And she's like, cold cases are not on here, but when you walk out the door, we're going to add them and we're going to do something. She said, I don't know what that is yet. We're going to brainstorm and we're going to figure it out. But we're going to do something, involving cold cases. And she has. And so, I hope we're also on the Cold Case Advisory Commission together for the state of Florida, the Florida Sheriff's Association, and there's not a lot of action from prosecutors and state attorneys in that commission. And so I stumbled upon this email the other day. The commission was meeting and kept talking about that. Like we've got to team up with the Prosecutors Association and get state attorneys on board and be able to talk, work together on solving these cases. And I found the email the other day where I immediately sent an email when I got back to town to Sheriff Sadie Darnell and said, we just got a brand new elected state attorney here. I met with her. She loves cold cases. And they took it from there, and I think they reached out and met with Melissa or talked with her, and then they offered her a seat at that table. And I think that's going to be, huge for the state of Florida. And then, as you see these things, I know we have a lot of people that watch that aren't in Florida, and a lot of people that reach out to us that aren't here, and they always want to know what we can do, outside of the state. And, kind of one of our goals always is to create a playbook for other states to kind of see what we're doing and adopt it in some forms. And that goes for like cold case advisory commissions, state attorneys' offices having cold case initiatives. We want to start seeing some results from these so that then we know people will jump on and we know that it'll happen. But as you know, from waiting 35 years on, that specific Puerto Rico case, it's patience with cold cases. And I'm not a patient person. I mean, I've had to learn to accept that there's a lot of things that are outside of my control, and there's a lot of moving parts with investigations and cold cases. But if you stick with it and you're committed to it, it will pay dividends. And we will.
And along the way, show some success.
Yeah.
Cases are being solved over the years. And JSO's had quite a few the last 3 years. Even going back, they've been doing cold cases for quite a while.
They have.
They've had success. Our office has had success. NCIS was very successful.
Yeah.
And still is.
And that's why I always call Lou like the godfather of cold cases, because he was interested in cold cases before anybody else was interested. Right. Before it was a pop culture phenomenon and on every TV show and every true crime, every podcast out there. Lou figured it out way before anybody else did that this was an important population of victims that were kind of underserved. Right. And a lot of times it really is priority. In agencies, in big cities especially, you have so much going on right now.
You got to devote the efforts to the hot cases.
If you give up on the hot cases, then you're just going to end up with them, again later on. So striking that balance of having the right number of people working on hot cases and a dedicated staff working on cold cases, prioritizing. We hear it a lot of times, like, we don't even know where to start. There's a county not far from here, west on I-10, and we reached out to them and asked for their cold cases to put in our database, and they said, we don't know how many cold cases we have because all of our cases are just in one vault together, and it would take hundreds and hundreds of hours to go through every case and differentiate which one is unsolved versus which one is solved. We don't have that in any kind of digital format, and and they're not going to do it.
Probably not. It's budget, manpower intensive.
So we've got to get to the point where hopefully somebody will come in there that does see the value and will start a project. We've worked with University of North Florida with interns in the criminal justice program. I know Tom Brady has offered us up interns here from Kaiser. There are avenues. One thing that people learn when they deal with me is there's no such thing as no. Like, right. we will find a way. And there are legitimate reasons why we can't always do it the way we think we can do it in the beginning, but that doesn't mean there's no way to do it. Right. And so when you start surrounding yourself with people, and that's what I see in your office, in that statewide cold case advisory commission, is it's not a bunch of people looking for ways to not do something. It's a bunch of people looking for ways to accomplish something and get something done. And I think we're really, really on the front end of seeing some cold cases be resolved.
I agree. As long as Melissa's there, we'll keep moving forward.
Yeah.
One thing too I want to mention about cold case, a lot of agencies get the program up and running, and it's budget driven. So if you got to cut someplace, usually it's the cold case program that will be cut. So you rely on volunteers and nonprofits and organizations like yours that really support it and keep it going, moving forward, and keeping the word out there.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll keep moving forward. I mean, especially with your organization, what you've done, bring attention to the victims and the families.
Well, it is really good to have the different heads on this monster all working together and trying to push forward in one direction, and not feeling like we're undermining, what I mean, or we're pointing fingers. It was really something that was very important to me when I started this organization. Was I looked at some other organizations that helped homicide victims, not really cold case, but homicide, and realized that there was a lot of frustration and anger, a lot of finger pointing, and we've always kind of been under the, I just fully believe that there is somebody to be mad at. But it was the person that committed the crime, not the people investigating it. Right. And I do realize that I have a very unique perspective. I've gotten to sit in that room sometimes and review cases and listen to the information that's not always public information, and that does change, kind of the way you think and see and view these things. But we were always fearful that as an organization, that law enforcement would feel like we were pointing the finger at them and saying, you didn't do something, and now we're having to come in and take over and do it right. And that was never what we did. I mean, we're not investigating these cases, first of all, so it was never a, we could do something better than you can. It was this is an issue. You'd be hard pressed not to see it as an issue when you look at the numbers, but let's all do this going forward, working together, and let us handle the families, because that's what we're good at, and that's what we do.
You've been a good buffer for the agencies, for us, going between law enforcement, prosecutors, and the victims' families.
Yeah.
So it's a good relationship, professionally, personally, and we appreciate what you do.
Well, I appreciate that. Has anybody made any questions or anything? We sometimes we get people wanting to know. I should tell people to get their questions together ahead of time, but is there anything else you want to add, Tim, before we we sign off on.
Excited to be back in Jacksonville.
Yeah.
We always considered Jacksonville home, and then Melissa gave me the opportunity to come back to Jacksonville. So we're happy to be here. Love the community. Love working with Project Cold Case, JSO, the other agencies in the area. Good relationship.
Yeah, were you was your goal to retire here? Like
It was,
when? Yeah,
yeah.
you just was sped up a little bit.
Well, we just like Florida when I come
Yeah.
back here. So I didn't really plan to work with Melissa. 'Cause I didn't know what opportunity was going to be there. It came along. She offered it to me, and
Yeah.
so I'll keep working for a few more years, maybe.
There you go. There you go. Well, we hope you'll stick with us for a while because
Probably will,
you know I do think we're on the cusp of good things and great things with cold cases, and that only happens with people that are committed to it. And you've seen firsthand with victims and their families. You've seen firsthand what violence does. You know, and so you've traveled the world. I mean, you talked about a couple of tours in Afghanistan, right? And,
Yeah.
you know, where else did you go?
Pretty much everywhere.
Yeah,
Far
yeah.
East. I did 4 tours in the war zone. Spent a year on an aircraft carrier. Australia, Singapore, Japan, Korea. Went to the DMZ a couple of times.
Yeah, that's
I mean, it was some cool stuff. I was very fortunate to have had the opportunity.
well. Thank you for everything you've done for this country, for the those serving, and fighting for them, and in your family, and what that's not an easy life for
No,
your
I'm
wife
still
and
married,
kids.
so my
yeah,
wife
that
deserves all the praise for that. So
says
she stuck
something.
by me all those years.
Yeah, well, wonderful for them and you, and now you guys can just kind of kick back and stay in one place for a while.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah.
All right, Tim. Well, thanks so much for coming out today and helping us out. And hopefully we'll have you back in with a specific case or something in the future, one that we've worked on together. And thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll be back. We're still working on getting Melissa rescheduled. It's potentially for next week, but she's got another appointment that could make it run short, or we're trying to work with the times a little bit. So stay tuned. We'll let everybody know. If she's not here next week, we'll have her in as soon as the schedules align, and let her talk a little bit more about why she cares about cold cases, and obviously enough to bring you in and give me access to you guys, and we'll get her take on it. So thanks again for tuning in today. We'll see you next week, and we'll let you know who's going to be the guest then.